Hello, I'm Kip Strain, and today we'll be talking about A Christmas Carol and who Scrooge is and how he is redeemed. Key ideas. In this presentation, I will cover who Scrooge is and how he finds redemption through this story. We will take an in-depth dive into Scrooge's character, and we will go over why Scrooge needs to be redeemed and how he is forced to do it. The last thing we will cover is how Scrooge changes from the end of the story to the beginning of the story. In Scrooge's introduction, at this point, I'm sure most of y'all know the basics of the story, A Christmas Carol. The part of this story that I will go in depth about is the character of Scrooge and the deeper meanings behind his story. At the beginning of the story, Scrooge is presented as a horrible, greedy, and mean man who is stuck in his rude ways. In the story, the writer goes to great lengths to make sure the reader understands this when he describes Scrooge as a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scrapping, clutching, covetous old sinner. This extremely long description of his personality shows that he is obsessed with money and that he isn't willing to change his ways. Scrooge and his clerk. We see several other people in this story, and most of them see Scrooge as the grouchy old man he is. Bob, his clerk, had to endure very harsh working conditions for a very small amount of pay. And this is described when the writer says, "The clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal, but he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his room." This line of text shows that Scrooge doesn't care for his employees at all and would rather have them freeze while working than waste any of his coal because he doesn't want to spend money. Throughout the story, we also see Scrooge threaten to fire the clerk several times for not doing what Scrooge says, and that just goes to show uh, that he doesn't want to be a good employer anymore. Scrooge and his nephew Fred. Fred is Scrooge's nephew and is the next character that we meet, and he comes to wish his uncle a Merry Christmas and invite him over for dinner. This is also where we hear the iconic line, "Bah humbug," clearly indicating how Scrooge feels about his nephew's offer and Christmas as a whole. In Scrooge's eyes, the idea of Christmas is nothing more than a waste of money and time. This goes back to the idea that Scrooge is just greedy and how he has been for a very long time. Scrooge and the charity workers. When Scrooge is met by the charity workers, it is made even clearer that his thoughts and his entire life revolve around him making money. He makes several comments about the poor, calling them too lazy to work, and making comments about how they are just criminals. And when the charity workers show up in the story, we can really see that Scrooge has just no empathy for the working class or poor people in general. Scrooge's redemption. At this point in the story, we're fully aware that Scrooge is a rude, inconsiderate, greedy man who is stuck in his ways. The only way to make him change his ways is a frightening wake-up call, like the ghost of his dead friend coming to warn him of three other ghosts. Marley, the ghost of his friend, is severely punished in the afterlife because of his greed during his lifetime. The ghost is cursed to walk around Earth while covered and tied up in chains that are very heavy. The ghost seems to be trapped in purgatory, and his way of making it to the afterlife is helping Scrooge change his ways before it was too late. So this is also kind of him trying to redeem himself and also making sure that Scrooge doesn't have to go through this same punishment for his greed. Understanding Scrooge's past. When the first ghost comes to visit Scrooge, he takes him back to the past where the viewer of the story see a much different version of Scrooge. We see Scrooge being dropped off at a boarding school and being abandoned by his family during Christmas. This gives the reader more insight as to why Scrooge doesn't like Christmas, and this also shows why he is so set in his ways and doesn't really allow other people to get close to him. Understanding the basis of Scrooge's past makes it much easier for the viewer to want to see his redemption later in the story. By connecting his past feelings with his current behavior, we see Scrooge slowly start to emphasize, empathize for his rude behavior in the present. Understanding Scrooge's present. The main The main place we see Scrooge taken to by the second ghost is his clerk's house. Scrooge sees this family still works hard and are good people, and this makes him reflect on how he talked about the poor and all the comments that he made earlier to the charity people. And this is only made clear when Scrooge hears that Tiny Tim, Bob's son, will die if their living environment doesn't change soon. And it really makes him reflect on everything that he's done up to this point. And Tiny Tim is one of the biggest motivators for Scrooge's redemption and acts as a reflection towards Scrooge's comments about the poor in the beginning of the story. Understanding Scrooge's future. This part of Scrooge's journey is seen as the most terrifying part of it for Scrooge. At this point, we see Scrooge has come to accept the lesson that he is being taught and is willing to change his ways. If Scrooge was all if Scrooge has already accepted his ways, then why does the ghost even show him the grave? Well, this is done not to scare Scrooge into becoming a better man, but to remind him that he doesn't have a very long time left on earth anymore, and that he must move with a purpose to truly change his ways. Scrooge's redemption. When Scrooge returns to his present and his bed, there is a lot of excitement in the air, and the writer describes this by saying, "Yes, and the bedpost was his own, the bed was his own, the room was his own, best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in." We can we can see that this story as a whole is in a much more positive light, uh, with words like best and happiest being used. Another thing that is a clear indication of a shift in tone is the exclamation marks being used, which gives it uh which gives Scrooge a very more lively feeling and makes him just seem happier as a person. He then meets each character that was introduced at the beginning of the story, starting with the charity workers. Scrooge's Redemption 2. At the beginning of the story, Scrooge is very unwelcoming to the charity workers when they show up at his work. After Scrooge's ghostly experience, however, he goes out of his way to catch up to the workers so he can make a sizable donation to their charity. This shows how Scrooge is instantly trying to redeem his past actions and how he really does feel bad about them. Next, Scrooge meets with his nephew again, and his nephew can barely even recognize his uncle after the change in his behavior. Scrooge goes out of his way again to talk to his nephew and build a better relationship with him and the rest of his family. Finally, Scrooge goes to meet with Bob's family. When he meets with the clerk, he tells them that he is going to raise his salary, and this shows that Scrooge has truly changed and is striving to be a better employer as well. The writer makes a subtle nod to Scrooge becoming a better employer by changing the way he even talks to Bob from the beginning of the story to the end. Scrooge only calls him the clerk at the beginning of the story, but by the end he calls him Bob, I think 3 separate times, and that just shows how he's wanting to be more in touch with him and uh more more human like with his behavior towards Bob. Closing statements. For the closing statements in this presentation, I would like to take a look back at how Scrooge is described at the beginning of the story, and he is described as once again as a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scrapping, clutching, covetous old sinner. This long line of adjectives really just shows how greedy Scrooge was, because most of those words do just mean greed. And in the ending of the story, Scrooge's new feelings are described as a good, as good a friend, as good a master, as good a man. The word good really just resonates with Scrooge now at this point and really just embodies the change in character that he's had. And it really just shows how he's a new man entirely with a new outlook on life for the rest of his life. And that was my presentation. Thank you.